name is Zerbe. I'm a Water Watch Director with Delaware Riverkeeper Network. We are an environmental organization based out of the Delaware River watershed. I live down in Philly, and I'm really happy to be here. I grew up in the abandoned mine regions of Schuylkill County, so my grandfathers were both coal miners in different realms. Here's a picture of Potter Zerbe. He was my grandfather that I never met. He worked in an old coal breaker. And my other grandfather was part of a very small coal operation. He actually was down doing what they call robbing the pillars, which has to do with anthracite mining. And he hit some water and he got crushed in the mine. So there's a long line of history of folks in my family who worked for the mine, got sick from the mine, but still, made a living from it. Which is why when everything happened with gas, it just seemed like horrendous to me that we're going down this same road. So Delaware Riverkeeper Network, again, we're an environmental organization. I do a lot of science. I do a lot with citizen monitors, and that's why we're going to be talking about enforcement a little bit and what citizens can do to watchdog the industry a bit and to use that to make some positive changes while we're fighting it to ban it everywhere. And I'm going to talk a little bit about environmental impacts and the watchdogging, and then a little bit about some legal cases that we won. Again, I'm not an attorney, but I'll talk about that a little bit and how that weaved into the work that our volunteer monitors did, and some of them are in the room. So again, every gas pad, Alex talked about this, has a gathering line that's connected to it, and then it's connected to the larger intrastate lines. And I know most folks I've met, how many of you are from Pennsylvania? Can you just raise your hand? Okay, and then how many of you are Massachusetts? Because I felt like everybody was meeting so many people. Okay, cool. All right, awesome. So you know all about drilling then, you know all about the amounts of wells that have been going across, but I just wanted to mention, again, in Pennsylvania in 2009, over 8,100 unconventional wells have been drilled in the state. So as you know, we're a big impact zone here in Pennsylvania. We talk a lot about New York and keeping banning fracking in New York, but we've also kept drilling out of the Delaware River Basin Commission because of all the work that all of you have done. So I always like to point that out. We're not drilling the entire state at this point. The eastern half is off limits at the moment, and it's because so many different people came together from so many places. As the speakers mentioned before, moms groups came together. Union groups came together. I feel like we also had downstreamers connecting with upstreamers. Again, it's a different language that Alex always talks about because we have to use a different voice depending on where we're at, but people kind of got a little bit unified for this. And we had the loud city people down in Philly, that area, like coming up to the headwaters of the Delaware River Basin to try to make our voices heard and let people know, hey, you live up here and we appreciate you being good stewards, let's keep this out. Again, we weren't always heard very well with people who were going to be getting leases, but I feel that it really brought us together, and I feel that it helped keep the moratorium in place, which still stands today, and it's a victory, and we won't talk much about that now, but I think it's important that we all pat ourselves on the back because we all work towards that. So then, of course, what happened was, okay, right now, take a breath. There's not really gas drilling, but wow, they want to push all these interstate pipelines across the Delaware River Basin. How can we help stop that, stave that down, and slow things down? So we got involved with looking at pipelines. And of course, Alex showed some photos yesterday, but this is a large intrastate line with a frac pad site. Again, all the infrastructure and causing the fragmentation and all the cumulative impacts that were happening. Again, this is, I think, a TNC slide that a lot of people use that show the different wells, the different pad sites, and again, we saw a lot of that yesterday. Fragmentation, again, I'm more of a science person, so again, I apologize, but I know it's something that maybe organizers want to know a little bit more about than the average public. But again, there's a lot of acreage of fragmentation that's happening because of pipelines. We got involved. Really, our story was, there was a line, Tennessee Gas Pipeline, that was going through around 2009, 2010. And we were really behind the 8 ball because we really had been just learning about drilling and learning about the issues. And we started going out with our volunteers and realizing, wow, stuff's really hitting the fan and we're having a lot of impacts. So what we decided to do, and again, just giving you a feel here, the Tennessee Gas Pipeline Northeast Upgrade Project, again, and we'll talk about segmentation later, But just for that pipeline project alone, it was going to be cutting through 90 streams, 136 wetlands, and developing over 450 acres of land. And of course, it's often very much pushed in public spaces. We'll talk about that in a minute. And we realized that pipeline construction is a long process. Greg Latordo was a big part of this too, because he worked in the construction industry. He said, wow, there's a lot of places where things can go wrong. And again, we realized in this case, this was coming down the pike. How do we stop it? If we can't stop it, how do we watchdog it so that we can help with other pipeline fights in the future and help really get our advocacy and litigation faced with facts based on things that volunteer monitors did. So FERC gave the Certificate of Public Convenience back in May 2012. I know a lot of you have probably worked with FERC and you realize it's kind of, we feel that it's a squeaky wheel, but there's been progress made, right, because of a lot of the work that you guys have been doing. And we realized that there were a lot of accidents happening. Just looking at the past pipeline project where we really weren't organized because it was before, we were dealing with gas in general, we realized, wow, stuff's really going wrong. And who's out there watchdogging and who's looking at this, who's looking at it on the ground. And you have local conservation districts who are looking, but they're strapped, their staff are small. A lot of them might be more political than others. Some are better than others, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen that as well. And we know that looking at what FERC does, again, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, right? Whenever FERC looks at anything, it's with rosy glasses on, right? When they are out there and their inspectors are out there that are paid for by the industry, by the pipeline companies, they're not seeing violations. They're not seeing problems. So essentially we realize, just looking at this stat that I won't read, but we're realizing that they're not doing the job, right? And again, if we're not able to stop the line, we want to be able to get out there and watchdog it, to really just get to the press, get people to understand, just because you see something on paper doesn't mean it's what's actually happening on the ground, which again, a lot of you know, but a lot of people don't know it. They assume, oh, everything looks great. They're getting the record on the FERC docket. It looks like there's, the inspectors are out and everything's fine, but you realize they're essentially lying. Time and time again, you'll see that. So, because I work with volunteers, and that's the reason we get to do monitoring throughout the Delaware River Basin, because we have incredible volunteers. I know a lot of you are volunteers in this room too, but we have lots and lots of people who do different types of monitoring at Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and we decided in 2011, hey, we have to mobilize. We have to do some sort of pipeline watch, incorporate some of our existing volunteers, recruit new volunteers to look at pipelines, and to do basically a quick and dirty visual assessment is what folks essentially did, mostly taking photos. So they were out there. Joe Zenas, who you might meet later, I think he's coming today. He's been a volunteer monitor with us for many years. We were able to hire him on for a little bit of time to go out. He knows Pike County, which was one of the key areas that we were looking at in Pennsylvania. So we got volunteers out there to look at the lines and figure out what's happening. Now, I know you guys in Massachusetts are also dealing with TGP, so a lot of the pictures that I'm showing you are Tennessee Gas Pipeline pictures and what they've done in our state prior. So what did we find? Well, we found problems with tree cutting, right? They're starting tree cutting in some of these areas. They have very bad mapping. They're cutting down trees outside of the right-of-way. There's problems with documentation and the way that they're fueling near wetlands, they're fueling near streams. Some of our baseline stuff, we went out before the cutting and before the industry was going to be building it, and we tried to document where we felt what TGP was saying was actually not what was happening, right, with wetland delineations, trying to get them to work around headwater tributaries to cause less damage. So those are some of the things that we did with baseline, and then of course during the tree cuts. The other thing, as I said, is on paper it looks hunky-dory, but then you realize things aren't working. So this is another thing that we found. We found bypass structures, right? So again, the company will say they're doing something one way. This is considered basically a dammed area, so that when they're cutting through a stream, they're supposed to pump the water into one of these structures to limit the amount of water and sediment that goes down the stream. But a lot of times this is what we found. We saw places where they were bypassing it, they really weren't building the right things. So this is all stuff that we watchdogged and we got on the record. And that was the key thing. We tried to get it on the record as soon as we could to show their violations and that they're really bad actors, which all of us in this room know. But we felt that we needed to do that to get it on record. So it's part of something that we can use for litigation. Again, these pipelines cross a lot of streams and tributaries, so we try to target volunteers along those sensitive areas. That's Delaware Riverkeeper. We work mostly in water issues, so we wanted people to be around wetlands, around streams, to sort of document those conditions. Of course, we found problems with stream cuts, foliage getting cut down, which is, again, how many of you have been out on a pipeline, a big intrastate pipeline? Can I see your hands if you've seen a big? All right, cool. So not tons, actually. That's good. But again, these are some of the cleanest streams in Pennsylvania that they were allowed to just cut right through. They're called high quality or exceptional value streams. They're the best streams that we have in this state, and they were getting demolished by the pipeline companies. So we tried to show that. Of course, then we also saw when you cut down all the trees and wetlands and streams, you end up having problems with the oxygen for the fish, and you have just heat sinks, right? So things were heating up. We have record with probes that we put into the water that show these streams that are supposed to be for trout and for fish, which is really important in those areas because there's a lot of fishermen, a lot of ecotourism. We had high stream temperatures because of the impact from these pipelines. So again, we collected that data to help with the advocacy, to help with the litigation. We also found tremendous soil compaction. The pipeline companies will talk about how there's no soil compaction, everything goes back, it's all fine, it's remediated, it's restored. We found places where temporary workspaces where they cut down trees were very compacted, that of like an earthen dam. So you change the soil profile forever. So these are all things that we documented. We find conditions with access roads, again, just kind of to tell the story of wildlife, the effects of wildlife, because you have a lot of trucks and traffic going through remote areas, so you're getting impacts from wildlife, like this young bear cub. And we found altered groundwater flows. And again, all of these things are things that you can't really necessarily tell to the public necessarily, but this is all stuff that we felt needed to be part of the record to build our cases. And of course, we found issues with groundwater contamination and well water contamination with sediment and turbidity getting into wells where the line was cutting through. We also found ag impacts. This actually wasn't Delaware Riverkeeper network, but some farmers are looking at ag impacts. This works really well when you're talking to farmers who are concerned about their land. We found stress and tree mortality stress outside of the right-of-way. So that compaction that happens with all that heavy equipment, it kills the roots. So even if the trees are on the side of the right-of-way, they're often affected. They don't do so well. They don't all die, but there's issues there with edge effect, and I won't totally go into that. This is just a great slide I just put in because it talks about the potential impact radius, right? The blast zone. I'm sure a lot of you use this in your talks when you're talking to people. And the idea that when you have a right-of-way, you have the landowners next door, but there is the blast zone outside of that right-of-way that can be calculated. Anybody can do this, and you can figure out what your blast zone is based on the size of the pipe and some other components. The one thing to keep in mind with this, and I think this has worked really well with folks who are in hazard zones, because the folks in the hazard zone, they are not going to benefit from the pipeline, right? Not that anyone benefits, but the idea is they're not getting any money, but yet they might be evaporated and incinerated if there's an accident. But what that also means is then you have the pipelines going into areas that are more remote, right? And I've seen this with many pipeline battles, which is why we always want to make sure people know no pipeline path is a good path, right? We don't want it going through residential communities. We don't want it near schools, but we also don't want it through our public lands. That's not why our lands were protected and restored. So it's a tough battle, but what that means when it goes through areas that usually aren't residential, it's going through steep slopes. This is an example, I believe, this is Columbia Line in Pike County. When you have steep slopes, it's really hard when you cut down all the trees for the sediment to stay on the right-of-way. So you have a lot of issues with sediment blowouts. So again, these are all pictures that volunteers have taken. I'm just going to breeze through them. Why do we care about sediment? Does anybody know? Why do we care if sediment goes in a stream? Does somebody want to just... So it's not me talking. Tracy? Right, it smothers all the macroinvertebrates, it smothers the fish, the juvenile fish. It also causes thermal impacts in the sense that the sediment is often warmer, so it actually, the water gets warmer. So we don't like to see sediment in these things. And this is what we saw time and time again, multiple times. And the only way we saw it was that we had volunteers at as many locations as we could get them. I've been doing volunteer monitoring for many, many years. I've never seen so much bullying of people by the pipeline operators, with volunteers who are, 60-year-old moms going out and they're just getting bullied by the pipeline people. Here's an example of wetlands and wetland impacts. So again, we used all this. Invasive species, of course, plants, right? This is a corridor for all those invasives. And this just gives a stat of kind of what sort of the baseline of what we sort of documented over about a 4-month period. This is not everything. But again, we use this and we always put it on the record. And we also gave it to our attorneys to talk about, hey, this is gonna help build your case, right? As we're saying pipelines are an issue, let's build the case. And one of the key cases I wanted to talk about is the segmentation case. Does everybody know what I mean when I say segmentation? Right, this idea that pipeline companies segment their projects so that they do not have to do better standards through NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. And essentially, so they play this game where they go through and they'll just segment little bits and pieces. And so here's the 300-line upgrade, which kind of hit us by surprise, right? So they built these little sections here. Then they went up and started doing the NEAP, which is where we got most of our data because we actually were organized for that. You see these little pieces here, Wayne County, down here in Pike County. We spent a lot of time in Pike. There was a little piece over here in New Jersey. So they segment these little bits and pieces so that they don't have to do the stronger environmental regs, which again are not that strong either, but they're better than not. And what that means is then they have to do it, they often do an environmental assessment instead of an environmental impact statement, which is a much longer process. As I say, with a lot of issues with monitoring, with any type of advocacy or environmental issue, a lot of times we're just stalling, right? We're stalling, we're trying to slow it down and hoping that the gas bubble bursts while we're slowing things down. But essentially, Delaware Riverkeeper Network, New Jersey Sierra Club, New Jersey Highlands Coalition took FERC to court. We again used all of that citizen watchdogging information in there to basically say, it's common sense, but segmentation is not something that is reasonable, and that the impacts from pipelines are such a big concern that you have to consider cumulative impacts. You can't just keep doing these small segments, and this is a very big impact in very many ways, and we've documented using the science. These are some key points with the court on segmentation that you can read. If anybody wants these slides, I'll give them to you. But essentially, the pipeline can't really do its job unless it's connected to the other part of the pipeline, right, from start to finish. And that's what the court agreed on. They said, yes, FERC was wrong. FERC can no longer segment these cases. And we're seeing how it's going to play out now. And how is it playing out, right? How have things changed? Well, this was just last year. So we're seeing what's going to happen. Are they going to consider just one pipeline? Or are they going to consider all the various pipelines that are going to different areas? These are all things that we argue, right, when we're testifying. We argue that it has to be about cumulative impact from cradle to grave. It also has to include the source, and it has to include the export and the end product. If they're refrigerating that LNG to negative 250 degrees or whatever it might be, what's that energy that's used? All of this needs to be considered by FERC, and if they're not, they're breaking the law. This is just another case on environmental rights. I just wanted to point out it was another victory, Robinson Township, Delaware Riverkeeper, and others against the DEP, basically saying that everyone is entitled to clean air, clean water. So this was another big win, and it works real well in some of the more rural areas too with our rights. And this was a conservative justice who basically said, by any reasonable account, the exploitation of the Marcellus Shale formation will produce a detrimental effect on the environment, on the people, their children, and future generations, and potentially on the public purse, perhaps rivaling the environmental effects of coal extraction. So this kind of solidified what's already in our PA Constitution, and people are using it time and time again to kind of reinvigorate the legal process as to what we're allowed. So some other good things are coming down the pike. Again, we'll have to see how things work out, but there's the Transco Leidy line that's actually going to cross the Tunkhannock. We're kind of in that area. So legally, there's a stay on tree cutting at this point with the Transco Leidy line. It was just this past week. We're going to see what happens with that. And then also DRBC's Columbia line. This week there was a meeting with DRBC. We try to go to their meetings all the time, every other month they're out there. And they also are not giving a docket that we're hoping will help with some restoration of some past pipeline projects. But again, what we submitted was all stuff that volunteers collected. And we submitted that on the record to the Delaware River Basin Commission and said, you let this go through, you had the harm, this was your bad and your foul, and now you have to be doing some other things. You can't just be permitting it retroactively. So there has been some changes. And I just end, of course, with renewable jobs, right? There's another option. This is all things that we can talk about, and it's technologically feasible, right? It's good news. It's not the 1960s anymore. So we always try to talk about those green jobs and really just getting things done. So thank you for your attention.